Hello, and welcome to today's episode of How to Be a Great GM, where we're talking about aliens and how to develop them for your science fiction style game. And it's an interesting question, don't you think, on how to make aliens as interesting, as different, as unique, and as memorable as, well, aliens can be. So how do we do that? How do we make aliens unique? How do we make them different? And how do we make them interesting? Well, of course, you know me by now. It is all about the story. So how or why or what is the alien is not necessarily as important as to what is its function. If its function within your story is to propel the characters forward, then the alien might need to have certain things that would prevent the characters from remaining with it. If, on the other hand, the alien's raison d'etre, the reason why the alien should be there, is to delay the characters, then you might have a very different alien. If the alien's reason is simply to provide color or descriptive atmosphere, well, then you can have a very different type of alien to the one that needs to delay the characters or advance the characters. So figuring out the purpose that the alien performs in your particular scene is very important, because once you know that, you can then move forward into creating the alien. Now, there are two authors that I respect very much, Stewart and Jack Cohen, and they have written a novel called Evolving the Alien, where they look at this exact question. It's a fantastic book to read, and if you can get hold of it, that's great. Now, you might be wondering, Ian, Stewart, Jack Cohen, where have I heard those names before? They co-authored a series of books called The Science of Discworld, Volumes 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know if there was a fifth one, with Sir Terry Pratchett, who was a great inventor of different and wonderful spaces to play in that all usually centered around some kind of story element. And so they looked at how to make aliens as interesting as possible. What do we look at? Where do we even start? Well, now that we know the purpose that our alien is going to serve within our scene, we can then start to decide, is it going to be an aggressive alien? Is it going to be a passive alien? Is it going to be big? Is it going to be small? Now, the advantage that we have over filmmakers is that we don't need to stuff somebody into a suit, so we don't need to fall back on that age-old, it's a human, Jim, but she's got a funny forehead thing stuck on her eyebrows, and so she must be a different species. We have the luxury of describing the alien as being 180 meters long, weighing 90 tons, and having 12 heads. Oh, maybe that's just a hydra. I don't know. The point of the matter is that it is up to our imaginations to craft something that is spectacular, and then it is the burden of being the GM to then make it work. Because players being players, if they find something interesting or new, they're going to want to interrogate it as far as they can. So we look at the environment that the alien would have grown up in. We've decided that we're going to create a passive alien who is merely there to guide the players from this spaceport to that moon over there. How are we going to do it? Well, let's look at the alien. Let's say the environment they grew up in. And again, remember, it's all about expectations and changing those expectations to suit your own needs. So the expectation is, let's say it's a humanoid species. Now, let's go and throw up in the bathroom and come back and be proper great game masters. This is a species that has 4 legs and a torso and arms and a head. All right, that's getting us somewhere. What would a 4-legged creature be doing out on its planet's surface? Would it be foraging for food? Would it be running in herds? Are they quick? Maybe they're not quick. Maybe those 4 legs are actually little stubbly little legs, and it sort of drags itself forward. Well, that's a little bit more disgusting and a little bit more memorable than, say, a centaur. So this little sluggy-like creature which drags itself forward on these very basic limbs, maybe it leaves some kind of slime trail, which has some kind of medicinal property if the players really want to scan it. That's still flavor. So these little slug things don't move very quickly. So how do they take over their planet? Do they invent lots of mechanical devices that allow them to walk over the surface of the planet on these multi-legged mechanical constructs? Maybe. Maybe, on the other hand, they have good mental powers, and so they can control other creatures to carry their corpses around the planet. That sounds a little bit more interesting, and since we want them to get the players to get off of the station, well, wouldn't it be great if the players suddenly had this message in their head? "You are not welcome on this station. Leave immediately." And if any of them have a psychic power, they will detect that there is this almighty brain somewhere that is directing them to leave. They can't really fight the psychic, unless that's your campaign, and then they will discover that this is a species that grew up using the power of its mind to manipulate everything and everyone around them. They simply can't defeat it. Remember, of course, it wants them off. It's not going to kill them or hurt them or threaten them. It is simply going to direct them to leave. And since this species is used to now controlling other species to do its bidding, it will expect them to do the same. And you can use it to simply force the characters to leave if you want to. If they do come across it, though, you can then describe it as this slug-like body with these little appendages being born on the back of several other alien species, some of which they might recognize or they might not recognize, as some kind of imperial overlord who looks down on the minions around them. All of that comes out of a little alien who needs to get the characters off of this station and out to that moon. If it's an aggressive species, maybe we want to make it more exciting. I think I've given you an example of how to use the environment to help shape the creature. What we can now look at is we can look at how do we come up with the basic idea of the look of the creature to begin with. And for me, what I often find as the most interesting is to go to those wonderful National Geographic magazines and obviously our glorious internet and to Google strange-looking creatures. This is not necessarily my goal. My goal is to simply build up in my head a library of as many different species as we have on this planet. An elephant-looking alien has been done because I can put a man in a suit and stuff an elephant head on him and he's an elephantoid. What hasn't necessarily been done is a giant slug that has multiple eyes all over it. Or perhaps it's some kind of shrimp-like creature which has giant tusks and floats in a glass bowl that's moved around by a mechanical device. Or the glass bowl is carried by a beautiful woman and the shrimp controls her with his long tendrils that have grown out of him and into her body. Something like that, perhaps. So I try and find animals that exist on this planet and fuse them together to make them slightly different. What if it's a bat-faced creature, but that it has multiple wings, different types of wings? What would that do to them in their environment? So it's about trying to create a visual and then linking it into an environment type situation. We then want to take it and add another level of flavor to these characters, and that is to think of their culture. So with our four-winged bat-like creature, they can fly. They don't necessarily need to develop a transport system because they just fly everywhere. But perhaps they are also blind, so they become paranoid about being inside a facility that is effectively full of all kinds of noises and radiation and so on and so on. Over time, their culture, however, has evolved some kind of headgear, which means that you now have a race that's got these strange wing-like appendages, but that wears a face mask whenever they're on a station, that breathes a strange gas or emits a strange low sound. It helps them to echolocate where they are within the station. Again, it's taking what we know and twisting and turning it and adding onto it so that we develop something that people have not necessarily seen before. Once we've finished looking at their culture, we then need to look at, well, why did they leave their planet in the first place? Now, one of the games that I'm playing, a player said to me, I want my character to be gaseous. Okay, gaseous characters have all kinds of attributes that will give them an advantage in one sense of the word. That's if they can remain cohesive. A lot of movies have used gaseous creatures before. Hellboy 2, for example, had a gaseous character, but he had the capacity to bring himself together when he was released from his suit so that he didn't waft all over the place. We decided that this particular species didn't have that capacity, and any form of agitation of their form would disperse them to the four corners of the universe. So how did that species evolve? Where did it even come from? We determined that it had grown up in a gas giant, and that what had happened was that slowly particles over centuries or millions of years had started to gain a collective sentience whilst drifting around this gas giant. They wouldn't have been able to escape because they have no means to escape and gravity would have kept them on the planet. At the same time, they're busy building up a sentience, and then the very first spaceship that enters into orbit over the planet and enters into the atmosphere is suddenly flooded by this strange gas-like substance. They haven't encountered it before, the gas creatures don't know what these funny flesh bags are, and so the crew die and the gas is completely unaware. Then repeat this process over thousands or hundreds of years, and the gas creatures start to realize if they inhabit the spacesuits of the creatures that keep entering into their space, they can form a sort of manipulation over these spacesuits, and suddenly the universe opens up to them. So now we have this gaseous creature that inhabits a spacesuit which is now articulated and constructed to their needs so that it will perform as they would like it to perform, traveling the universe, just experiencing different stuff. Gravity, for example, is an amazing concept. When you are floating in an atmosphere and your species is the size of a planet, to be constricted down to this one little entity that's so fragile gives a certain amount of an adrenaline rush to the species. Not that they have adrenaline or could rush, because they have no means of self-locomotion. Everything becomes an experience. That's an interesting alien that is, unfortunately, for my example, humanoid, because that's the spacesuit it's wearing, but is an actual fact a planet-sized gas of super intelligence. I think we often tend to think too small when we're thinking of alien species, and we don't necessarily think far enough out of the box. Some examples of alien species are, of course, Star Trek and Star Wars. Star Trek decided the cheapest option was prosthetics on the forehead. Star Wars, for example, decided that wedge-shaped species or bizarre things that don't really make much sense is a better option to go, but generally speaking, they were all pretty much humanoid, because that's what they needed. Babylon 5, exactly the same thing. Fifth Element didn't even bother trying. They simply painted someone blue. The feature film Aliens turned to Geiger for their inspiration, but it was still a dude in a suit. Right up until the third movie when they tried CGI, and that didn't really help them, so they went back to dude in a suit and stuck with the formula of 2 legs, arms, a tail, and a head. Theirs had the advantage of not having sight and bleeding acid for blood, which was interesting at the time, but they could have pushed it so much further. Why did it need to have legs and arms? Perhaps it should have floated. Examples where aliens have been done well, and they are getting better as our CGI advances. Star Trek tried a 3-legged alien species in Star Trek Voyager. It was completely CGI, and if you look at it today, it was laughable. On the other hand, at least they were trying. Series that made conscious efforts not to have humanoid species are things like Farscape. Farscape was an Australian-American co-production where everyone was a puppet except for the lead characters, and the puppets had different shapes and sizes and forms. If you look beyond the puppetry, which was excellent, but still a man's hand up an ass of a puppet, you actually appreciate just how different that universe feels, even though everything else is the same. The technology is the same, they go to hyperspeed, they travel in a starship, which is alive, by the way, and you get a different sense of the universe. In other words, they took the concept of alien and they just pushed it, and that's all they needed. Everything else could remain predictable and part of that genre setting, which is so important. Mass Effect, a computer game, also tried to have different types of aliens. They had big air bladders that looked like Man of Wars, the blue bottles that float around on the ocean, causing grief to swimmers all over the planet. They had one of those that had a communication method and long tentacles. Not a bad attempt, but they could have pushed it even further. They could have avoided the bipedal species that they had. And yes, there's plenty of arguments saying this form was seeded by the first creators at the very beginning, however you like to do it. If you want your aliens to be different, you need to make them physically different, and culturally, what I usually do is pull on a culture from Earth's history and then twist it into the extreme form to try and find something that's different about it, that will make the aliens feel as unique as your setting. That book again is How to Evolve the Alien by Ian Stewart and Jack Cohen. It came out quite a few years ago, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it somewhere. Very good book if you are interested in the actual physics and the biology of how aliens might be different if they grew up in a less heavy atmosphere, if they grew up in a toxic atmosphere for humans, if they grew up in a more dense gravitational field. It is a very interesting read. I hope this has been helpful in a brief glimpse in how to perhaps shape aliens so that they're a little bit more different than just your standard run-of-the-mill Klingon or Twi'lek. And if you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you haven't yet heard, there is a Thunderclap initiative that's busy running around until the end of September 2016 to try and drive interest in our Patreon account that we are launching on the 1st of October. And there are a lot of tiers there that people are getting very excited about. If you haven't had a look, go and check it out. Thunderclap video. It was launched 2 weeks ago. Until next time, happy gaming.